In just a breathless, heart-stopping 7 minutes in a courtroom in Louisiana, a black woman once dismissed, insulted, and thrown out of the courtroom had the most powerful white judge in the state arrested on the spot, leaving over 200 people stunned. In a system rife with bias, lies, and discrimination, what unfolded behind the scenes that made an entire empire of power kneel, all because of one name? Jasmine Crockett? Does true justice exist? Or is this just a rare miracle in the darkness? Jasmine Crockett took a deep breath as she entered the gates of the Louisiana State Courthouse. It was an old building, its gray brick walls worn with the passage of time. Each brick seemed to tell stories from the past, stories she could never forget. It felt like just yesterday when she was a young girl walking into this very place, full of dreams of becoming a passionate lawyer, believing that anything was possible, that everything could change. But then, this very place had rejected her for one simple reason. Her natural curly hair and her style didn't fit their standards. They didn't reject Jasmine because of her skills or her capabilities. They rejected her solely because of her appearance, a subtle form of racism she'd never been able to forget. As she walked through the large doors, an overwhelming sense of suffocation began to take over her. The long hallway, filled with portraits of famous judges throughout history, seemed to watch her, but not with eyes of respect. No, these were silent statues, indifferent, unable to see the struggles she had endured. She knew they still didn't see her, and they never would. Her footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor, each step a quiet declaration. She was walking back into the place that had once cast her aside, but this time, it wasn't to beg or to submit. She was stronger, sharper, and most importantly, she had power. Approaching the security desk, Jasmine's gaze remained unflinching, but the guard there looked at her like she was a stranger. He furrowed his brow when he saw her badge and then asked a simple question that felt like a slap in the face. "Are you a relative of the defendant?" Jasmine stopped and didn't rush to answer. She knew she'd have to face these kinds of looks, the judgmental stares, the mocking questions. But today, she wasn't the fresh graduate, the unknown person they'd once turned away. With a steady gaze, she pulled out her federal ID badge and held it directly in front of the guard. She didn't say a word, but the silence between them spoke volumes. It was power, a status she had earned after years of struggle. The guard lifted his eyes to her once more, then looked down and checked her name in the system. An eerie silence filled the space. Jasmine could feel the tension in the air. She knew the guard was judging her, not by her ID or her position, but by the look in her eyes. And she knew if she wasn't strong enough, if she didn't project enough confidence, they would see her as the nameless woman they once dismissed. After what seemed like an eternity, the guard finally stepped back and allowed her to pass. No apology, no words of respect. But for Jasmine, this was only the first step in a much larger battle. As she stepped into the hall, the familiar pain of walking into the courthouse washed over her again. Every small detail, every corner of this place, reminded her of the discrimination, the apathy of a legal system she once admired. A faint smile touched her lips. It wasn't a happy smile, but a smile of preparation, as if she knew she would win here, despite the many times she had been belittled. Every step Jasmine took was a challenge. She wasn't just facing the people who had once insulted her. She was facing a system that had ignored her voice for years. But this time, she wasn't here to accept things as they were. She was here to change everything. And as the courthouse doors closed behind her, Jasmine felt like everything around her had stopped. She couldn't go back. There was no turning back. Because this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who had been oppressed, humiliated. This time, she was here to break down the wall between justice and truth. A question echoed in her mind. This time, can they stop me? Jasmine Crockett stood motionless in the vast room, surrounded by familiar faces that were anything but friendly. The courthouse staff passed by without a second glance, completely ignoring her presence. No one stopped. No one asked if she needed anything, as though she was nothing more than a minor detail in their busy lives. Their eyes flicked over her quickly, never pausing long enough to recognize who she was. Even though the ID badge hanging from her neck was clearly a ticket into the world of power. But Jasmine knew, in their eyes, she was still just another black woman, not worthy enough to command attention. Despite rising to become the deputy legal advisor for the vice president's office, she could still not overcome the barriers society had built for people like her. Her natural curly hair, her professional attire, nothing could mask the discrimination she still faced. She had once believed that her status would be enough to change the way people saw her, but now she realized the truth still stung just as deeply. No one offered her a seat. She was left standing alone in the corner of the room like an outsider, as if her presence here was without reason. Jasmine recognized that the courthouse was not only a place of justice, but also a place of discrimination. And in the silence that surrounded her, she could feel the weight of the glances that passed her by. Why didn't they recognize who she was? Why did they treat her like she was insignificant, even though she was here not just to observe, but to confront the very system that had once made her feel invisible? That question spun in her mind, but she refused to let herself sink into despair. This wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed, and it wouldn't be the last. She couldn't let that stop her. Standing tall, she fixed her gaze forward, toward the courtroom, toward the place where everything would change. Jasmine stepped into the courtroom, where everything seemed unchanged. All eyes turned toward her, but not with the respect or attention she deserved. The large room, with its rows of public seats and silent attorneys, felt like a museum. No one moved. Everyone was absorbed in the tense atmosphere of the trial. But for Jasmine, that tension was thick with indifference and unfriendly gazes. As she entered, she immediately felt the coldness from the people in the room. Strange whispers, avoiding stares, all of it made her feel like an outsider in the very place she had once dreamed of standing at the podium. Every step she took echoed heavily, as if she was no longer herself but the shadow of the years gone by. With the seasoned eyes of someone who had faced prejudice, Jasmine walked toward the witness stand. But just before she could step up, a cold voice rang out from the bench where Judge Thomas Miles sat. He lifted his head from the pile of papers scattered on his desk, his sharp gaze scanning over Jasmine, a look devoid of emotion, one of hasty judgment, as if she were nothing more than an inconsequential part of his busy day. Immediately, the corners of the judge's mouth curved into a sneer, a mocking smile. It wasn't just disrespect, it was open contempt, as if he was mocking her very existence in the place where justice should have been upheld. "Who did you think you were?" "The backup witness," he said, his tone flat and dismissive, without a hint of respect. His words, light as a breeze, cut deep into her heart. "I'd appreciate it if you kept quiet. We're serious about our work here." The words hit like a slap, an unfair judgment, and it was in that moment that a storm began to brew inside Jasmine. Backup witness? She was an integral part of this case. She wasn't some insignificant figure, someone just there to play a supporting role for those with power. But to him, she was just a disposable tool, a person of no importance, not worthy of attention. Each word, each glance from Judge Miles brought her back to the painful memories of the past. Jasmine remembered her first day here, when she was a hopeful intern, eyes bright with a belief in justice. She recalled walking into the courtroom with a passion for change, only to be met with mockery from the legal community. They didn't look at her, didn't see her potential. They only saw her skin color, her appearance, as if that alone defined her worth. Rejected because of my skin color, she thought to herself, dismissed because of my differences. But those painful memories didn't break her. They only fueled her resolve to stand firm in the very place that had once turned her away, where she would no longer let anyone judge her based on her appearance. The feeling of being looked down upon was nothing new to Jasmine. She had lived with it since childhood, enduring belittling words from friends, teachers, and people around her. But no, today was not the day for her to falter. Today, she stood here not only to reclaim what she had lost, but to tear down the walls of discrimination that the legal system had built. She stood tall, facing the cold gaze of Judge Miles, but there was no fear in her eyes. She said nothing, simply placing her briefcase on the table. One final look, a deep breath, and then she took a step back, preparing for the next move in a journey that no one could stop. In that moment, Jasmine realized one thing. No matter how much he mocked her, no matter how much he thought she didn't belong here, she would never be a backup witness. She would be the witness of change. And in the end, he would be the one forced to face the truths he had spent years trying to hide. The trial opened in a solemn atmosphere, but Jasmine couldn't feel its gravity. Although she stood at the back of the courtroom watching a case she should have been a part of as a prosecutor, this time she was just a federal witness. She had been called in to ensure transparency in a case she knew would not be easy, especially when dealing with a system that had long protected itself from the truth. As the silence enveloped the room, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that this trial, despite its significance, was already being undermined by a preordained fate. She scanned the courtroom, observing the black woman standing at the witness stand. The woman's eyes were filled with anger and pain, a raw emotion that mirrored Jasmine's own. The woman was accusing the police of unjustly assaulting her, simply because of the color of her skin. Jasmine could see the fear in the victim's eyes, but she also saw her resilience. She saw the fight in her, the determination not to let the injustice define her. Jasmine knew this case wasn't just a fight for the woman standing there. It was a fight for everyone who had been crushed by a system that claimed to uphold justice but too often failed to do so. As Judge Miles began the trial, the atmosphere in the room became heavier. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone, but Jasmine felt an eerie tension settle over the proceedings. Every question from the prosecution, every answer from the defense, seemed pre-planned, as though the trial had already been written and rehearsed long before it began. The defense attorney's questions quickly veered off course, shifting from the heart of the matter to trivial details that had nothing to do with the case. They were doing everything they could to distract from the truth. Jasmine immediately recognized the game being played. The evidence that the prosecution had painstakingly gathered started being dismissed without any real consideration. A video recording of the police assaulting the woman, a piece of key evidence, was shoved into a drawer and not even shown to the jury. Witness testimonies from people who had seen the assault firsthand were cut short by Judge Miles before they could say anything substantial. His gavel slammed down with an air of authority, silencing the voices of those who sought to speak the truth. Jasmine could feel her blood boil as the injustice unfolded right before her eyes. She looked around the courtroom, seeing the same pattern of silencing and disregarding anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. The defense team was relentless in interrupting, cutting off the witnesses at every turn. Every time someone came close to revealing a crucial detail, Judge Miles was quick to dismiss them, claiming their testimony was irrelevant to the case. Jasmine could see that no one was allowed to speak unless it fit the narrative that had already been decided. The truth, the real story, was being buried under layers of manipulation, lies, and power. It was a show, a performance that had been rehearsed long before this trial even started. Jasmine could see it clearly. This system didn't care about the truth. It only cared about protecting those in power and maintaining the status quo. Those who were oppressed, those who suffered under its weight, were not the ones the system was designed to protect. She could see the manipulation in every move, every word. This was not about justice. It was about maintaining control. Jasmine knew from the depths of her soul that this trial had been rigged from the very beginning. And when she glanced back down at the black woman in the witness stand, she could see the pain, the disillusionment written across her face. The woman had trusted the system, only to be betrayed by it once again. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of the years of injustice she had faced. Jasmine saw the same helplessness in her eyes that she had seen in so many others, those who had been forgotten, ignored, and dismissed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. But Jasmine wasn't going to let this happen again. This time, the system was not going to win, not while she was here. Although Jasmine wasn't sitting at the defense table or in the prosecutor's seat, she could not stand idly by and watch everything unravel before her eyes. As a federal witness, she had the right to intervene, and she was not going to allow this trial to continue to be manipulated. She knew that if she didn't act, the truth would be buried deeper, and another injustice would go unpunished. When Judge Miles interrupted yet again, Jasmine could feel her anger rising. The injustice was suffocating her, but she knew she couldn't let it take hold. Standing up, she pulled a thick stack of documents from her briefcase, a pile of evidence she had meticulously gathered over the past few weeks, carefully preparing for this moment. She was ready. She had worked too hard for too long to let it all be ignored. She wasn't going to let the system continue to sweep this under the rug. She walked toward the witness stand, but as she stepped forward, a voice rang out from the other side of the courtroom. "What do you think you're doing?" We don't need you here to criticize. Jasmine locked eyes with Judge Miles, her gaze unwavering, full of defiance. Then she turned to look at the woman standing at the witness stand. Her eyes were filled with empathy and solidarity. This wasn't just a case about police brutality. It wasn't just about one woman's struggle. This was about human rights. This was about the fight for justice that every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, deserved. Jasmine wasn't here to criticize. She was here to make sure the truth was heard, to ensure that this system did not continue to ignore those who needed its protection the most. She was here to fight for the woman who had been wronged, for the countless others who had been silenced. This trial would not continue on its predetermined path. Jasmine was about to change the course of history, one step at a time. She wasn't just a witness. She was the witness of change. Jasmine stood firm on her feet, her eyes locked on Judge Thomas Miles as he remained seated, leaning back in his large chair, his expression cold. It was a space she had become all too familiar with, but today, nothing about it felt familiar anymore. Everything had faded into the background, no longer about justice, but about a play where all the actors knew the script, yet no one could change the ending. She took a deep breath, feeling the suffocating weight in the air, but she couldn't stand still. She couldn't just watch these people continue to lie, continue to manipulate the truth, continue to kill justice right here in this courtroom. She had prepared meticulously, and she knew that today she could not stop. Jasmine walked toward the witness stand, pulling out a thick stack of documents from her leather briefcase. These were the crucial pieces of evidence she had spent weeks gathering. A recording in which the victim had provided vital details about the incident, captured when she was still in a state of panic after the assault. Jasmine knew this was irrefutable evidence that could reveal the truth, but in a system like this, would it be enough to break through the wall of indifference? As she placed the documents on the table, all eyes in the room turned toward her. Judge Miles lifted his head, and immediately a faint smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a smile of respect, it was a sneer, a contemptuous look, as if he saw her as a fool trying to perform in a place of solemnity. "Don't bring your racial theories into this courtroom," Judge Miles said, his voice as sharp as a knife, void of any compassion or understanding. "Here, we deal with the law, not emotions." The words echoed in Jasmine's mind, but they did nothing to make her falter. Emotions? Did he think she was acting on emotion, or was he just trying to downplay the truth? She couldn't let his words stop her. They couldn't continue turning a serious case into a joke with meaningless words. Jasmine stared into Judge Miles's eyes, not rushing to reply. She didn't need to argue. Her silence, that steady gaze, was her answer to everything. She stood tall, unbowed and unbroken. She would not allow herself to be judged based on emotion, but by reason, by the facts, and by the truth she held in her hands. She wasn't an attorney playing a role. She was a person on a mission in which every step, every decision was aimed at uncovering the truths that had been hidden for far too long. Judge Miles stared back at her, his face unchanged, still smirking. But Jasmine was ready. She pulled back the documents and, once again, without blinking, she faced him. All she needed to do now was to continue her persistence, to stand firm in this courtroom. She would not allow him or anyone else in this room to dismiss the truth any longer. The recording, though dismissed in this trial, would not be silenced. Jasmine would find another way to bring it to light, another way to break through the wall that separated truth from lies. As Jasmine stood there, silent, simply taking notes and committing everything unfolding to memory, a faint laugh echoed from behind her. It wasn't the sound of amusement, but one of mockery, as if everything she was doing was just a joke. The lawyers sitting behind began to whisper among themselves, their eyes full of derision. A few of them chuckled softly, but it was enough for Jasmine to hear. She couldn't help but notice they weren't laughing for any reasonable cause, but because of her presence, as if she were merely a decoration, an insignificant part of an important trial. The court clerk glanced over, and then shook his head in a disapproving way, almost acknowledging that people like Jasmine didn't belong in courtrooms like this. The glances weren't just cold. They were laced with quiet contempt, as if they had all already decided she wasn't important enough to be respected. And in that moment, Jasmine felt something sharply. She wasn't just insulted by their words, but by the silence itself, the indifference that the entire room had towards her. She wasn't part of this system. This system didn't see her, not because she lacked the confidence, but because it had been built to protect people like Judge Miles, to protect those with power and those who were untouched by people like her. When Jasmine lifted her head to look, her gaze didn't waver. She couldn't let their mockery make her falter. But that feeling, the feeling of being left out, of being overlooked, came rushing back. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way. She had faced these cold stares before, these cutting words. From the days of being a student, when she was told she couldn't be in the ranks of the top students because of her skin color, to her time in college, where she was considered not outstanding enough to be part of the important study groups. Then there were the countless job interviews where she was always overlooked because she didn't fit their standard. That feeling of insult was something she had tasted since she was a young girl. But now, standing here in a courtroom, facing people who had the power to change the fates of thousands, this feeling could not defeat her. She wouldn't let it weaken her resolve. She continued to take notes, but not just recording what was happening. She was documenting every detail, every look, every gesture, every word. Because she knew that today would be the day everything changed. Every action, every word they spoke would be evidence of the injustice they were upholding. Whether they laughed or mocked, she wouldn't let herself become the punchline. She was a part of this system, not an outsider. And once the truth was revealed, no one would be able to disregard her or people like her again. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't respond to the mockery. She just stood there, continuing to write, preparing for what was to come. Those glares didn't make her waver. They only made her stronger. Jasmine sat in silence in the courtroom, her eyes never leaving Judge Thomas Miles, who continued to preside over the trial with decisions that dripped with bias and injustice. Though her lips were sealed, her heart was racing. Every beat seemed to urge her to act, a constant reminder of the past, of all that had been wronged, all the pain that had shaped her journey. In that moment, the world around her began to blur, fading into nothingness. The sounds of the courtroom, the back-and-forth debates, the drama unfolding, it all became distant, like a fading echo. It was just Jasmine now, in the heavy weight of memories, of sorrow and injustice, pulling her back to a place she could never forget. She couldn't forget the face of her mother, a woman who had suffered more than anyone could ever imagine. Her mother was a beloved high school teacher, known for her dedication to her students and her passion for education. She had been respected, cherished even. But one day, due to a small administrative error, a mistake she never made, her mother had been wrongly convicted in this very courtroom. It wasn't her fault, but the consequences were severe. It had cost her mother everything: her job, her dignity, and all the respect she had worked so hard for. Jasmine could still recall the day her mother stood at the witness stand, facing Judge Thomas Miles. Her mother had cried, but not for the injustice she suffered. She cried because she knew there was nothing she could do to prove her innocence. She cried because no one in that room seemed willing to listen. No one in the system had the courage to stand by her. And when Judge Miles signed the guilty verdict, Jasmine had never forgotten the look in his eyes. It wasn't just a look of indifference. It was a look of cold, calculated judgment. It was a look that told her mother that, no matter the truth, it didn't matter. The fury inside Jasmine stirred like a tempest, one she could no longer suppress. The anger was visceral, raw, and uncontrolled. She wanted to jump up, scream, and tell them all how wrong this was, how unfair it was that her mother, an innocent woman, had been destroyed by a flawed system. But she had remained silent then, as she did now, because silence had been her only option, her only defense. And yet, sitting in this same room with the very person who had signed her mother's wrongful conviction, Jasmine could no longer let that pain simmer. She could no longer stand by as the same man wielded power over innocent lives, manipulating the truth and feeding the injustice. Her mother's image appeared before her once more, her gentle eyes filled with hope when Jasmine was just a child, her encouraging words whenever Jasmine faced failure. But this time, her mother wasn't there to stand up against the unfairness of it all. Her mother had been crushed by this very system that had promised justice but delivered only pain. And though her mother was no longer present to fight for herself, Jasmine was. And she would make sure no one else had to endure what her mother had gone through. Judge Miles continued to steer the trial, But Jasmine no longer heard his words clearly. The voices of the courtroom, the back and forth of arguments, all faded into the background. It was as though the only sound Jasmine could hear was the beating of her heart, thumping fiercely in her chest. Each beat felt like a vow, an unspoken promise that this would not stand, that she would no longer be a passive observer in this story. She was no longer the young girl she once was, uncertain and silent. Her mother had taught her how to stand tall in the face of adversity, how to hold her ground when the world seemed to be against her. Today, Jasmine would not rise for her mother alone. She would rise for all the people who had been silenced, for all those who had been pushed aside because they didn't have the power to fight for themselves. The strength building within her felt like a tidal wave, one that would sweep away everything in its path. Her memories, the images of her mother, the years of watching injustice unfold in front of her eyes, everything had led her to this very moment. And now, she would not let this system, this broken system, continue to destroy lives. She stood slowly, silently. There was no fanfare, no dramatic words, but inside her, a fire had been ignited, one that could not be extinguished. She pulled out the recording, the evidence she had prepared. This was no longer just about proving her mother's innocence. It was about something far larger than that. It was about ensuring that no more lives would be ruined by lies. No more people would suffer the same fate as her mother. She had the truth, and she would use it to tear down the walls of injustice. As she walked toward the stand, she could feel the eyes of the room on her, but they no longer intimidated her. Judge Miles could no longer control her, could no longer dismiss her as insignificant. She had made her decision. She was no longer just a witness to these crimes. She was the force that would reveal them to the world. The recording of the victim, the carefully gathered evidence, these were no longer just pieces of paper or sound bites. They were weapons, weapons of truth in a battle against the system that had allowed such horrors to continue. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for her mother anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone whose voice had been silenced. Jasmine Crockett was back, not as an observer, not as a passive participant, but as the agent of change. She would not let this room of power and privilege dictate the fate of the innocent. She would not let them forget the truth. And in that moment, Jasmine knew the tides were turning. The truth was about to break through. Back then, Jasmine was just a 17-year-old girl, her eyes filled with hope, but also with fear. She stood outside the courtroom, silently watching through the frosted glass. The sounds from within were not the voices of justice, but whispers, unreasonable judgments that she couldn't fully hear. She only knew that the cold gaze of Judge Thomas Miles, the nods from the attorneys, and the silence of everyone present in the courtroom made her feel a pain that words could not express. She stood there alone, gripping the hem of her skirt as if letting go would make everything fall apart. Tears couldn't help but fall, but she didn't dare let them run down her face. Her mother, the woman who had taught her how to stand strong, how to be resilient, was now standing before the judge, wrongfully convicted for an administrative error she didn't cause. A small mistake, yet this system was ready to use it to destroy her life. Jasmine could only watch her mother, her heart tightening. She couldn't step into the courtroom, couldn't speak up, because she knew she couldn't do anything when the system was so solidly built. She could only stand there, outside, watching her mother being stripped of everything. A teacher with an undying love for her profession, the strong mother she loved, now had to endure an unjust verdict for a small error they themselves had caused. The footsteps of those in the courtroom seemed like the steps of the indifferent. She saw her mother bow her head in pain, not because of guilt, but because of the apathy and injustice of a system she had once trusted. Jasmine felt it. She felt the emptiness of it, knowing her mother couldn't speak the truth. She cried, but not because of her mother's pain. She cried because, for the first time, she understood that justice was not always represented by those in black robes. Justice wasn't a perfect image. It was a constant struggle, a battle not everyone was ready to fight. This system, with people like Judge Miles, did not represent justice. They represented power, manipulation, and silence in the face of the crimes they committed. Standing there, Jasmine felt the loneliness in her heart, but she also realized something deeper. She couldn't let this injustice continue. She couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. She had sworn to return, to ensure that people like Thomas Miles and anyone in this system would no longer destroy innocent lives. But this time, she wasn't coming back for revenge. No, Jasmine didn't need to seek revenge. She was coming back to make the truth speak. That day, she had sworn never to let the truth be buried in wrongful convictions. She would be the one to speak the things the system didn't want to hear. And now, sitting here in this courtroom, everything had changed. She was no longer the weak girl standing outside, watching her mother being pushed into the darkness. She was the one leading this battle, the battle for the truth, for justice, and for all those forgotten by this system. Jasmine didn't cry anymore. She was no longer that girl from years ago. She was the woman now, the woman who would shatter the silence and speak the truth that, for so long, they had tried to hide. In Jasmine's hands now was a top-secret file, a thick stack of documents with pages that had not been publicly marked. But inside them lay terrifying secrets. Each page detailed cases she had been following over the years, cases that showed signs of being manipulated from within, verdicts that those in power had orchestrated to ensure the innocent would suffer. Jasmine looked at each document, each word a testament to a system rotting from the inside. These were cases that some judges, lawyers, and police officers had tried to cover up by any means possible. Corrupt verdicts, destroyed evidence, testimonies twisted to serve the interests of the powerful. This was the justice system she had once trusted, but now all she saw was a web of lies where the truth was buried, where the powerless never stood a chance of being heard. As Jasmine flipped through the pages, a lump formed in her throat. In every case, she could clearly see the traces of Thomas Miles, a name that appeared so frequently she could no longer ignore it. He was the one who had signed the unjust verdicts, the one behind the wrong decisions. And none of this was by chance. Each time his name appeared in the cases, Jasmine felt like a sharp knife was slicing through her heart. Because of that name, because of that man, her mother had suffered the injustice, and she herself had been pushed out of the battle for justice. She remembered the first time she saw the name Thomas Miles in her mother's case file. Back then, she was just a girl, and that name made her feel like the world was inherently unfair. But now, as she looked at these documents, there was no longer any confusion or helplessness as there had been before. Instead, she felt a fire ignite inside her, a determination she had never known. She wasn't standing up just for her mother anymore, but for all the people who had been trampled by this system, for those who had no voice. Jasmine gripped the documents tightly, her eyes scanning the names and the evidence recorded on each page, feeling the pain in every line. Each page was a cry for help that the system had tried to push aside, but she wouldn't let that continue. The painful memories of the past rushed back, but Jasmine didn't look back. She wasn't going to kneel like she had when she stood outside the courtroom, feeling her own helplessness. This time, she wasn't bowing her head. She was bowing it to the pain that had made her stand tall. The tears no longer felt like weakness. They were the flames that would burn away all the wrongs, leaving no trace behind. She had sworn to return, not for revenge, but to make the truth speak. And today, holding these files, she knew she was ready to face those who had ruined the lives of countless innocent people. She was no longer the girl who stood crying outside the courtroom. She had become the woman who would topple the dark forces, not only for her mother, but for all those who had been crushed by this system. The courtroom became heavy with tension. Jasmine sat still, her eyes never leaving Judge Thomas Miles, who continued to conduct the trial with coldness and smugness. It had been a long time since she had felt herself in such a conflicting space, a space where truth was pushed aside, ignored, and injustice was distorted. Jasmine knew she couldn't sit idly any longer. The video recording of the victim being assaulted, the crucial evidence of the case, all of it had been dismissed. All of it was being obstructed. But today, she wouldn't let that happen again. She couldn't sit by while innocent people continued to be denied the chance to achieve justice. As Judge Miles continued to dismiss a new piece of evidence from the prosecution, Jasmine stood up. Every eye in the room turned to her. There was no permission, no invitation. Jasmine simply stepped into the middle of the room, her eyes steady and filled with determination. She knew that this silence was only temporary. She was no longer the girl on the outside, no longer the powerless witness. She was part of the system, and she would change it from within. The courtroom seemed to pause for a few seconds, every eye trained on her. Judge Miles furrowed his brow, quickly scanning her with a dismissive look and shaking his head, disregarding her presence. "You have no right to do this. This trial is continuing," he declared, his voice cold. But Jasmine didn't stop. She kept walking toward the witness stand. A wave of murmurs rose from the attorneys seated behind her. They exchanged hurried words, and within moments, Judge Miles tried to push back, raising his hand in an attempt to interrupt. But Jasmine wouldn't give him the chance. She pulled out a thick stack of documents from inside her jacket, not ordinary papers, but classified files. She placed the documents on the witness stand, and for a moment, the room fell into stunned silence as all eyes remained fixed on her. Jasmine confidently pulled out her official ID badge and held it up before Judge Miles. "I am the Deputy Legal Advisor for Federal Security, and I am officially exercising my special intervention rights as part of an internal investigation into this state's judicial system," Jasmine declared, her voice unwavering and strong, clear as it echoed through the silent courtroom. Immediately, an invisible shift swept across the room. The people present couldn't help but notice the change in Jasmine, in her eyes, in the way she stepped forward and spoke. She was no longer the dismissed witness. She was a person of power, someone who could change everything. Her words were a declaration of war against a system that had hidden the truth for years. Judge Miles said nothing, merely staring at Jasmine, his eyes filled with discomfort and surprise. Clearly, he was unprepared for a confrontation like this. A few people in the room started whispering, their eyes full of doubt and unease. But Jasmine didn't let it faze her. She knew these people didn't understand, didn't know that she wasn't just fighting for the truth of a case, but for all the people who had been overlooked, undervalued, and crushed by those in power. She hadn't come here to continue enduring the manipulation of a decaying system. She hadn't come here to sit quietly and listen to their lies. She came here to change everything. And this time, silence was no longer an option. The courtroom fell into sudden silence, as though everything in the room had come to a halt. In that moment, the eyes of the lawyers, the court staff, and everyone present were all fixed on Jasmine. What began as surprise quickly turned into panic and anxiety. She stood there in the heavy atmosphere, as if preparing to unearth secrets that had been buried for far too long. Jasmine didn't need to say another word. She could feel the tension rising, the fear swelling in the hearts of everyone in the room. Each person understood that she was about to do something no one in this room dared even consider. She was about to expose the truth right before their eyes. She pulled out each document from the stack of classified files, carefully but decisively, each page revealing evidence that no one wanted to make public. First, she presented a document detailing large sums of money being transferred from a private law firm to a secondary account of the court. Jasmine didn't need to elaborate much. The numbers, the information in the document spoke for themselves. Large sums of money, untraceable sources, constantly being transferred into the court's secondary account, transactions carefully concealed, unchecked, unchallenged. Those funds weren't meant to serve justice. They were part of an underground network, a system of manipulation from within. She continued to flip through the pages. Emails exchanged between Thomas Miles and the defense attorneys appeared clearly. These exchanges, these cold, calculated lines of text, demonstrated clear collusion between Judge Miles and those running the case. These emails weren't just evidence of corruption. They were undeniable proof of wrongdoing, a pattern of misconduct that the legal system had ignored for far too long. And then, the final page, cases of wrongful convictions spanning over a decade. Each case had one thing in common. Judge Miles had signed the verdicts. Innocent people were locked away, victims of crimes who never got the chance to see justice, all because of decisions made by him. These cases weren't just numbers, they weren't just papers. They were lives destroyed. And now, those lives would not be ignored any longer. As Jasmine read each line, each piece of evidence, her feeling was not one of satisfaction. She didn't feel victorious. Everything around her seemed to melt into a picture she had painted long ago, a picture of injustice that no one had dared face. The people in the courtroom could no longer look at one another with calm eyes. The panic, the fear had spread like wildfire, and no one could extinguish it. Judge Miles stared at the documents on the table, his face turning crimson, his hands trembling as he gripped his gavel. Jasmine no longer needed to look at him because she knew he couldn't refute a single thing. His words now were just meaningless echoes in this space. She didn't stop reading. Each document, each piece of evidence was like a knife cutting into his career. The people in the courtroom no longer looked at each other with calmness. The anxiety, the fear had spread like wildfire, and no one could extinguish it. Jasmine continued to read, line by line, taking her time. With each passing moment, the tension in the room grew even more intense. She didn't need to do anything else. Everything was already clear. The courtroom fell into a long, heavy silence. No one dared to move. At that moment, Judge Thomas Miles could no longer contain himself. He slammed his gavel onto the bench, 3 consecutive strikes, each bang echoing through the room like a warning, but only serving to heighten the tension in the air. "I demand the arrest of this person," his voice roared, full of rage, not because he felt justice had been violated, but because his authority was being directly challenged in what he believed to be an unshakable courtroom. "This is an assault on the court." His words rang out like a direct challenge to the entire room, but when they echoed, they only seemed to paralyze everything further, a clear blockage of power that Jasmine could feel in the air. He was used to giving orders, used to imposing verdicts without facing consequences. But this time, he couldn't control himself, and that weakness made him appear powerless in the eyes of everyone present. From where she stood, Jasmine remained unmoved. She looked at him with unwavering resolve, no fear in her eyes, no hesitation. The entire courtroom was silent, only the echo of Judge Miles's gavel reverberating through the space. She turned away from the witness stand, her eyes locked on him as she slowly began to walk toward the judge. Each step she took seemed to tear down the wall of authority he had built over the years. The people in the room, whether they were lawyers or court staff, watched her closely, none daring to interrupt, none daring to make a move. They couldn't do anything when the truth had come so close. When she stopped in front of him, every gaze in the room was on her. Judge Miles stood rigid, attempting to maintain his stern demeanor, but Jasmine knew he was starting to feel something, not fear, but uncertainty. Jasmine stood tall, looking straight into his eyes, her voice calm but powerful. "No one is assaulting this court. We are merely returning it to justice." Each word she spoke was like a sharp knife cutting through his control. Jasmine didn't need to shout, didn't need to use force. She simply spoke the truth with a strength that showed she was ready to face anyone who dared to block the truth. Judge Miles stopped pounding the gavel, but not because he accepted her words. He just stood there silently, his eyes filled with confusion. The feeling of losing control over the situation was pulling him from the position he had held on to all his life. A judge who could never have imagined being directly threatened within his own courtroom. Jasmine didn't need to do anything else. She didn't need to appear angry, didn't need to raise her voice. Everything was unfolding naturally, as if justice had already found its way to speak for itself, without anyone's intervention. And as she stood there, everyone around her understood one clear truth: change was coming. This system would no longer remain the same, and Judge Miles, with all his power, would not be able to stop it. The 7th minute. Time seemed to stand still in the room, the tension suffocating. In the moments leading up to it, every eye in the courtroom had been fixed on Jasmine, standing firm in the midst of a trial that was unraveling. She didn't need to say anything else. The evidence had been laid bare, the questions no longer dismissible. This system, no matter how solid it seemed, could not escape the truth. And then, at the decisive moment, a sound rang out from the back door of the courtroom. The door swung open, suddenly and forcefully. Heavy footsteps echoed on the cold stone floor. The entire room fell silent, all eyes shifting from Jasmine to the door, and an overwhelming sense of anticipation filled the air. At this moment, no one in the room could have predicted what would happen next. The federal task force entered, their presence silent except for the weight of their authoritative steps. Dressed in black uniforms, their faces unreadable, and in their hands, arrest warrants prepared long before their appearance only heightened the tension in the room. Jasmine remained still, saying nothing. She simply stood there, her eyes locked on Judge Thomas Miles, who was now desperately trying to mask the panic rising within him. He had not expected things to unravel so quickly. Just as he thought he could continue manipulating the trial, a shockwave hit, sudden, and unstoppable. One of the agents walked forward, disregarding everyone else in the room, heading straight for Miles. Without warning, without any preamble, the agent read the arrest warrant aloud. Judge Thomas Miles, by order of the federal court, you are arrested for corruption, manipulating cases, and perverting justice. The room froze. Judge Miles stood stock still, his eyes wide with horror, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to protest, but no words came out. Those in the room exchanged stunned glances. It felt as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath, none of them able to believe what was happening right before their eyes. But nothing could change it now. The task force moved in, closing in on Judge Miles, not caring about his objections. With no hesitation, the silence in the room was suffocating, only broken by the sound of their footsteps and the clinking of handcuffs. Thomas Miles, once perched at the top of power, was now being handcuffed right there in the very courtroom he had once ruled with impunity. "No, this can't," he mumbled, but no one responded. It was too late. His words couldn't save him. The scene was not just a shock for Judge Miles. For everyone in that room, it was a suffocating moment, a moment that completely upended the balance of power. Those who had once believed they could manipulate justice now had to face the truth they had tried to bury for so long. Thomas Miles, who had once humiliated and dismissed the innocent, was now being led away like a criminal. And not a single word was spoken, only a thick, heavy silence remained in the courtroom. No one dared speak. No one could say anything after what had just transpired. Jasmine stood still, but she knew at that moment justice had truly been restored. And though there was no call for celebration, no hasty emotional outburst, every step Miles took out of that courtroom was a victory, not just for her, but for all those who had been trampled by this system. After the suffocating silence, the moment when everyone in the room seemed frozen in an empty stillness, a soft cry broke through. At first, it was a gentle sound, barely noticeable amid the murmurs and whispers, but soon every eye in the room was drawn toward it. It was a sob, a quiet, painful sound, but it ripped through the dense atmosphere of the courtroom like a tear in the fabric of reality. As people turned toward the sound, an elderly woman stood up from the back row of the audience. Her face, wrinkled and weary, her eyes filled with tears. This was the woman who had once been defeated by Judge Thomas Miles in a land dispute with a construction company. But now, she stood there with no weakness in her gaze. Instead, there was a quiet resilience she had hidden for years. The elderly woman trembled as she stood, gripping the armrest of the chair to steady herself. She was not a strong woman, but today she was doing something she could never do before, standing up and speaking her truth. She turned to Jasmine, her eyes filled with gratitude and deep emotion, then slowly made her way toward the witness stand where Jasmine stood. Each step she took, though slow and laborious, carried a powerful message. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer standing silently in the shadows of injustice. She reached Jasmine and, with trembling hands, she took hold of Jasmine's hand, squeezing it tightly, as if this were the only chance in her life to speak out about the truths that had been hidden for so long. No words were spoken, just the look in her eyes, filled with gratitude and hope. Every person in the room could feel the lump in the air, and homage to all those who had been overlooked, who had lost the battle because of this system. But now, they had found the chance to fight again. Jasmine looked at the elderly woman, her own eyes welling up with tears, but not from sorrow. These were tears of triumph. Yes, it wasn't just Jasmine. This elderly woman and others like her were the silent warriors who had endured through the darkest years. Now they had a chance to reclaim what had been lost. Jasmine felt the strength from that grip, from the determination in the elderly woman's face. Though it was aged, it was full of resolve. This woman was living proof of the change Jasmine was bringing. Every pain, every weakness was now replaced by an unstoppable will. They no longer had to endure. They had regained their power, the power not of the strong, but of the oppressed, the beaten down. The elderly woman said nothing, just holding Jasmine's hand firmly, as if to thank her, as if to declare war on the system that had tormented her for so many years. And in that moment, Jasmine knew that everything she had done, every step she had taken, had been worth it. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for all those who had been crushed by the system. After the moment of silence when the elderly woman took Jasmine's hand, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to shift dramatically. The tension still hung in the air, but now there was a sense of change, a growing awakening within the hearts of those present. Those who had witnessed so much injustice, so many lives crushed by wrong decisions, now began to realize they were no longer nameless in this fight. The man sitting in the back row slowly stood up, one step at a time. His steps weren't hurried, but they were firm and full of strength. His eyes were fixed on Jasmine, and without saying a word, everyone could feel that something profound was happening. He wasn't standing up just because of what she had done, but because of what he had endured: contempt, rejection, and decisions that had forced him to live in a darkness with no way out. As soon as the man stood, another person from behind him did the same. Then another, and another group of people, each of them stepping forward, no longer sitting quietly as before. These were individuals who had once been wronged, who had never been acknowledged by this legal system, who had been overlooked because they didn't have enough money to hire the best lawyers, who had had society's sense of fairness turn its back on them. Each step they took was heavy, not because of age or physical weakness, but because of the painful memories of legal battles they could never win. These people had once been victims of this system, forced to endure the silence of those in power. And now, they stood not to reclaim justice for themselves, but to witness the fall of what was once considered untouchable. The courtroom seemed to wake up. The surprised looks of the lawyers, court staff, and even those near Judge Thomas Miles were no longer filled with arrogance. A change had come, not only because of Jasmine, but because of those who had stood up, those who had been crushed by this system, now reclaiming their strength. Jasmine looked around, and these people were living proof of what she was fighting for. They weren't just witnesses. They were the ones who had suffered and quietly stayed out of the game. Now they were standing to show that silence was no longer an option. The ones who had been cast aside, who had been wrongly judged, were now standing together. They were the ones who had witnessed the change, the downfall of a system that had never been challenged like this before. Jasmine smiled softly, not because of victory, but because of the unity, the empathy she saw reflected in their eyes. They were no longer victims. They were warriors fighting for the truth. Jasmine stood still in the courtroom, her gaze fixed on the crowd watching her. She didn't smile, didn't raise her hands in triumph like those who had won in past struggles. Those victories were always accompanied by loud cheers, applause echoing through the air. But today, there was none of that. She just stood there, a silent figure amidst the sea of people staring at her, and all she could feel was the heavy, thick silence. Her shoulders trembled slightly, a small sign of the tension she had tried to suppress for so many years. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead, her breath slightly uneven, but her gaze remained steady, unwavering. She bowed her head, but not in defeat or fear. She bowed her head as a mark of respect, as a thank you to all those who had stood with her in this battle. In this moment, Jasmine didn't need a loud victory. She didn't need praise. All she needed was the silence because it was proof that justice had truly been restored. The room remained silent, like a confession from the very system that had long pretended to be blind to justice. They couldn't speak, couldn't refute or justify their actions. Explanations, blame, none of it mattered in the face of the truth. Jasmine knew she didn't need applause or cheers. This silence was all she needed to feel that what she had done was right. And finally, the truth had spoken. In the silence, the tension in the room tightened further. One by one, everyone in the courtroom, from the lawyers to the remaining court officials, could do nothing but accept this truth. Judge Thomas Miles, who had once thought he could manipulate everything, was now being led away like a criminal. All the power, all the arrogance had no value in that moment. Jasmine didn't need to say anything. She had fought enough. And when her eyes met those of the people who stood with her, those who had once been hurt by this system, overlooked, and underestimated, she knew they all felt the change. The change didn't come from cheers or recognition, but from this moment of silence when everyone understood that justice had truly returned. The news hit like a storm. Media outlets across the country carried the shocking headline: Louisiana judge arrested in courtroom. The nation was rocked by an event so unbelievable it seemed almost impossible. A judge with boundless power for years arrested in the very courtroom he had dominated. right before the astonished eyes of everyone present. The video of Jasmine standing alone in the courtroom, facing Judge Thomas Miles and the entire judicial system, quickly spread across social platforms. This video was not just an event, it was a symbol of resistance, of standing up to break down barriers that had been in place for far too long. Jasmine didn't need to say much. One powerful image, one decisive moment, and it was enough for everyone to understand that she had done something that many in society dared not do. She had exposed the truth right in front of those who had tried to hide it. Social media lit up. From those who admired Jasmine to those who had never heard of her before, justice for the voiceless flooded every feed, and discussions continued to swirl around the event. People talked about Jasmine's courage, her defiance of a system that most were too afraid to challenge. But Jasmine didn't need this attention. All she needed was for the truth to be known, and that was happening. Immediately after the event, the State Judicial Committee called for an emergency meeting. This meeting was convened to confront an undeniable reality. Over 300 cases from the last 15 years were to be reviewed. Every verdict signed by Judge Miles, every case manipulated and distorted, would now be investigated again. Each case, each decision he had made, was to be scrutinized once more. This wasn't just a step toward restoring justice. It was a massive blow to the very system that Miles had been a part of for so long. In particular, a network of connections between law firms and the court system was uncovered, a web that powerful people had constructed. And now, every corner of this system would be exposed. Lawyers, judges, and officials who had protected one another in the shadows would no longer be able to hide. Every testimony, every piece of evidence would be revisited. With each new piece of evidence, the truth would continue to come to light. This system was no longer solid, and all of it was thanks to one woman, someone who had stood up and spoken the truth. The next day, Jasmine attended a press conference, yet nothing about her stood out except for the calmness and humility with which she spoke. She didn't seek credit, nor did she praise herself, not because she didn't deserve it, but because what she had done wasn't for attention or personal glory. When asked about her actions, Jasmine looked directly into the camera, her eyes unwavering, her voice steady but deep. "I didn't do this to become famous. I did it because I was once the little girl standing outside this courthouse, watching my mother being taken away, unable to do anything." Her words were brief, yet they carried a world of emotion. This wasn't a statement from someone seeking to affirm herself. It was the words of someone who had once been a victim of the very system she was now confronting, a person who could never forget what her mother had endured, what she had suffered over the years. And now, Jasmine wasn't just fighting for her mother's justice. She was fighting for all the other innocent people who had been overlooked, mistreated, and ignored by this system. Her words hung heavy in the press room, leaving the space in silence. There were no cheers, no applause, just silence, like a confession for all the things that had been buried for so many years. Jasmine didn't need to seek praise. She wasn't doing this for attention. She was doing it for reasons deeper than most could understand, reasons that only those who had lived through it could truly comprehend. 2 months later, Jasmine stood firm in a space that once held her dreams, but this time it felt different. She had returned to the law school that had once rejected her, an institution where, as a student, she had been deemed unsuitable due to her natural hair and her style. But this time, Jasmine wasn't the student waiting for the chance to step into the classroom. She stood at the podium, not as someone who had to prove herself, but as someone who was there to teach, to inspire. She was the honored guest speaker, invited to share her journey and the lessons she had learned with the new generation of law students. The feeling was strange, almost surreal. She looked at the walls that once represented the barriers to her success, the same walls that had judged her, rejected her, and tried to limit her potential. But now, those walls seemed insignificant. They couldn't stop her anymore. She stood tall and confident, no longer the girl who was judged for her appearance, for her race, for her hair. She was a woman who had fought against the odds, who had overcome challenges that seemed impossible. And today, she was there to show others that they too could break through their own barriers. As she stood at the podium, Jasmine looked out at the sea of students seated before her. Their young eyes, filled with curiosity and hope, met her gaze. She could see their energy, their desire for knowledge, their dreams waiting to be realized. And in that moment, Jasmine knew that she had the power to impact the lives of some of them, not by giving them the answers, but by showing them that everything could change, even when the entire world seems to be against you. Jasmine began her speech, taking the audience on a journey of struggle and resilience. She spoke about her mother, the woman who had endured years of injustice, not only from the legal system, but from the people who had tried to make her mother step back. Jasmine shared the painful memories of watching her mother being dismissed, insulted, and pushed out of spaces where she deserved to be. She spoke of the times when she herself had been turned away, not because of her abilities or qualifications, but because of the color of her skin, the way she looked, and the biases others held. But Jasmine's story wasn't just one of hardship. It was a story of fighting through adversity, of never backing down despite the odds. She shared the painful times when she wanted to give up, when she questioned if the fight was worth it. But then she remembered her mother's words, words that had always stayed with her. You can't just wait for justice to come. You have to become justice. Jasmine wasn't just standing there to recount her struggles. She was sharing a message, one that would resonate with every person in that room. That they didn't need to wait for justice to come. They didn't need to demand it from others. They had to become justice themselves. She emphasized every word, every sentence, making sure these students understood that they couldn't just look at the world and complain about injustice. They had to be the change, the driving force behind the system's transformation. Justice was not something that was given. It was something that was earned and fought for. She looked at their faces, the students who would one day go on to shape the future of the legal profession, those who would face their own battles with discrimination and injustice. Jasmine knew that these young people would not have to kneel. They would not have to wait for someone to hand them justice. They already had it in their hands. They were justice, and they were the ones who would bring real change to the world. At the end of her speech, as Jasmine walked out of the auditorium, something unforgettable happened. Hundreds of students stood in the hallway, applauding. No one sat down. No one bowed their head. They all stood, not just because of the greatness of her journey, but because they understood the greatness in what she had done. They clapped not because she was a speaker, but because they recognized that Jasmine wasn't just an inspiration. She was a beacon, lighting the way for them. There were no calls for her name, no uproar. It was just applause, an outpouring of respect for the woman who had once been rejected, looked down upon, but now had walked into the very place that had tried to destroy her and walked out as a guiding light for the next generation. Jasmine didn't look back, but she knew in her heart that she had achieved something that once seemed impossible. From being dismissed and overlooked to being fully respected, she had proven that no one had to kneel anymore. Respect wasn't earned through compromise or concession. It was earned through inner strength, through standing firm in your beliefs, even when the world tells you otherwise. She smiled softly, her steps light but purposeful as she walked away. In that moment, Jasmine knew that her victory wasn't just a personal triumph, but a triumph for all those who had felt alone in their fight. She had opened the door for them to fight, to stand tall, and to know that they weren't alone anymore. Her journey had been one of resilience, but it had also been about giving others the strength to continue their own battles. Jasmine had paved the way for them, and they would carry her light forward.